I'm George Tscherny. I was born in Hungary, Budapest, in July 12, 1924.
My name is Alexander Tscherny. I was born in Berlin, Germany. This is the story of my escape from Nazi Germany.
My father, Mendel Tscherny, was a soldier in the Russian army in World War I. He was taken prisoner and wound up in Eger, Hungary, where he met my mother, Bella Heimann. And at the end of the war, he didn't go back to Russia, but stayed behind and married Bella. In 1926, my parents decided to leave Hungary and go to Berlin, Germany. The ironic part is that we left Hungary because of anti-Semitism and wound up in Germany. We went to Berlin. We stayed at my mother's brother, Ellis Heimann, and his wife, Jetja Heimann. It must have been quite an imposition on the family because they had 2 children of their own. My cousins, Gerhard Heimann, was probably 3 years old, and Kurt Heimann may have been 10 or so. In addition to this, while we were there, my brother Alex was born June 10, 1926. So we were eternally grateful for the Heimanns to put us up. My memories of that period at the Heimanns is of course very vague. I was 2 years old, and my first memories are really where we moved to Lübecker Straße 13. Lübecker Straße 13, Moabit, was really a sort of working class neighborhood. We lived in a basement under very poor conditions. I amazed in retrospect how my parents managed, because my father had no work. My mother made dresses. In Hungary she had been a milliner, so she had a certain amount of talent for using her hands, and we somehow managed to get through. By the time I turned 6, we entered the public school. This was the regular Christian public school. We stayed there probably until 1934, when we all transferred into a school run by the Jewish congregation in Berlin. This was at 58 Klopschakstraße. I did fairly well in all the unimportant subjects, in music, drawing, gym. Meanwhile, Alex had actually gone to another school. There's a picture where he did a Schulausflug with his classmates. One of the interesting things in Moabit was an Uferpalast cinema. In those days, all the movies were called palasts. And outside that movie house, they had hand-painted portraits of the movie stars that appeared in it. They were fairly large, full-size faces, and they were really the first indication that I took note of that sort of thing. They triggered my interest in art, and I really began to think in terms of art as possibly that's what I would like to do when I grow up. My life as a boy in Moabit was fairly circumscribed. Of course, it was the daily event of walking to school. In addition to that, on weekends, my music teacher had asked me to join a boys' choir that he conducted in a synagogue in Lützowstraße. One of the byproducts of going to that synagogue every Friday evening and Saturday morning was that they paid us car fare, or something like the equivalent of 60 cents, 60 pfennig, 15 pfennig per car ride. Alex and I, who also sang in that choir, we used 15 cents going home Friday evening, but the rest we kept, which was really our Taschengeld. Every Saturday morning after the service, we had a very, very long walk back to Rathenower Straße, where we moved to since. But it was a very interesting walk. Lützowstraße was right on the corner of Potsdamer Straße, which led us to Potsdamer Platz. Potsdamer Platz was really sort of the center of Berlin in those days. in terms of hotels, in terms of movie theaters. And there was a building that caught my interest, one of the first contemporary buildings being put up by a subsequently very famous architect, Erich Mendelsohn. The building went up around 1930, and it contained, surprisingly, the American branch of Woolworth. And that was our weekly stop, because that gave us an opportunity to spend some of the little money that we had gotten. I still have a little screwdriver that I bought there at that time. And then we continued on past Brandenburger Tor, the Reichstagsgebäude, back to our home, Rathenorstraße 67. We moved there. It was certainly a step up in terms of lifestyle. We had one big room in which the family lived, and a kitchen, very modest by today's standards, but it was certainly an improvement over Lübecker Straße. Rathenorstraße was actually a little closer to where the Heimanns lived, in the Perlberger Straße, and across the street from our apartment house, which was a typical sort of Berlin apartment house, which was built in the 1890s and occupied all of Berlin. I went back, obviously, after the war to look at Lübecker Straße, and that existed exactly as I remember it, and as it is in the photograph that I have of a little boy in the courtyard. In fact, I photographed myself in the same courtyard when I visited Berlin again in the 1970s, and nothing had changed. My first school, the Christian school, somebody had discovered that I had a certain amount of talent, and there was an after-school drawing class, and I was put into that and I participated. And there occurred something where I really noticed the first indication of anti-Semitism. One evening, the teacher called me over and said, "Unfortunately, you're going to have to leave the class because you haven't turned in enough work," which of course was not true. I turned in my work every afternoon, but that was an obvious indication in retrospect that I was being kicked out because I was a Jew. Except for the little incident of anti-Semitism that I experienced very early, I really didn't suffer from that very much. Poor economic condition was really worse than the anti-Semitism. The kind of people that felt anti-Semitism in Berlin in the mid-30s were really professional people who couldn't work, people who lost their businesses maybe, but actually there were Jewish businesses along Turmstrasse in Moabit all the way up to 1938. The turning event, that was a shock, the morning of November 10. I went off to school that morning without being aware of what had happened during the night. I arrived at my school, the windows were knocked in, the doors was closed, there was nobody there. I went back home, got my bicycle, and drove to the west where all the damage had been done. I stood outside Fasanenstraße, the synagogue in Fasanenstraße, as it was burning, and I was just like an observer, as if this wasn't even affecting me. And I went on to Kurfürstendamm where the windows had been broken, and that really was the incident that made me realize that there was no future for us in Germany. I remember lying on my kitchen floor looking at maps of how to get out of Germany. Berlin is fairly up north, and so my thinking was always that I was going to sneak onto some kind of farmer's truck going to Denmark or something like that. Until one day I received a postcard from friends that we had, a boy and a sister who had escaped into Holland. And it was amazing, an open postcard. They told me where to cross the border, where to go, what to do. Not long thereafter, I decided that Alex and I were going to go. A friend of my mother's took us to the railroad station at Bahnhof Zoo, and it was December 20th, and the train that was going to take us to the Dutch border was coming from Poland and was running late. By the time we got to the Dutch border, there was no way of going across. We got off the station in Kleve, which is the last city on the German side. People dispersed from the railroad station, and there we were standing, knowing nobody, knowing not where to go. Imagine I was 14, Alex was 12 years old. We'd never been in a hotel in our lives, but we started looking for a hotel. Now this is a small town, didn't have big hotels, but we came upon a place. We rang the bell and asked whether they would have a room for us. They said no. I don't know whether they really didn't have a room or whether they knew what we were up to. We started walking, not knowing really where to go, and came to another sort of small hotel.
And the gentleman said, can I help you? And we said, we need a room for tonight. And he looked at us and he said, where are you going? And so we're visiting an aunt in Holland, but we missed the last train. He said, are you Jews? And we said, yes. He said, well, it's really against the law to give you a room, but inasmuch as you're young boys, I'm going to give you a room. Don't tell anybody.
The next morning we went down for breakfast, and there was only one person in the dining room. He was reading the Völkischer Beobachter, which was the official Nazi paper, but he greeted us with Heil Hitler, and we said a Heil Hitler, and had our breakfast. We checked out and went to the railroad station, and calmly bought a ticket to Nijmegen in Holland. Nobody asked you for a passport or anything like that. We got our ticket. We got on the train. It was a very cold, snowy day. It was a typical railroad car of the 30s, where the little compartments. Alex, I said, sit by the window and you look out the window. Don't look at anybody, just keep looking out the window. The other people that came into the compartment was a farmer's woman with two little children and a clergyman. It was really, in retrospect, a scene out of a French movie. You know, I mean, these were people as if they were picked by a stock photo house, you know. The train made a stop, which is the last, may have been a village, stop before crossing the border, where the train personnel changes from German to Dutch. An SS officer comes walking down the hall and I think that we belong to that farmer's woman, and he only asked for the passport of the clergyman. There was another stop where the farmer's woman got off, and the SS officer came walking by and saw that Alex and I were sitting in there and asked for our papers.
These were SS stormtroopers, black uniform, normally known to be pretty tough and to be feared. So we were a little scared We had no IDs because we had no passports, we didn't have anything. So they came through and they said papers, and we said, what papers? He said, do you have an ID? I said, no, I don't have an ID. Where are you going?
I said, well, I'm being expected by the committee in Nijmegen. He said, what committee? I said, well, the committee. And this went on once or twice, and he said, don't let me catch you coming back, and closed the door, and the train went off. When we arrived in Nijmegen, we got off the train.
There was a passport control and visa control, and we said that we didn't have anything. And they said, well, you're refugees? And we said, yes. So they called a person from the committee, the Jewish community, who would review your background and make a decision on whether they would or would not accept you into Holland. So they said, okay, wait a moment, we'll make a call to this family and someone will come and pick you up. So it was a very nice family. It's 2 daughters, very, very lovely people. They were very friendly. They did speak German and gave us dinner and let us stay overnight. And they said, you may have to stay 3 or 4 days before the Queen is going to give us authorization to let you go, and you probably will be assigned to a refugee camp. 2
days later, word came that we'd got permission to stay in Holland. From there, we were taken to a town, Soesterberg. In that town, there was a summer camp that was run by a partisan group. Children in that community could spend the summer there. Since it was winter, there was nobody in that camp, and they generously made it available to German children refugees. We arrived there, and there were already children from 6 to 15. I was really one of the older by being 14. The kids were there from Austria, Germany. We were put up there, fed, and were able to go to school. The Dutch have a vocational school system that's very good. It's called the Ambacht School. And I signed up for cabinet making. And Alex decided they had a course in house painting. We were given a bicycle. I had to every morning ride to Amersfoort, which is where the school was. Riding bicycle in Holland is really quite wonderful because there are bicycle paths everywhere. The only problem is that many days were raining, and there's nothing worse than riding a bicycle in the rain. Plus the fact that I had no clothing to change to speak of, so I never really dried out. I was always constantly wet. That course in cabinet making was instrumental in making me aware of tactile surfaces. Instead of paper, I was dealing with wood, but still I became aware of material. Unfortunately, the thing came to an end when summer came, or spring, and the barracks had to be available for the people that were coming there for summer vacation. So they asked us if we could find other quarters, and the organization that assisted us always was the refugee organization called Heimann. And we were all taken to first a little town, or sort of a suburb of The Hague, Rijswijk, where I don't know why we couldn't stay, but I think we were there no more than 2 or 3 weeks. From there we went to a very luxurious villa in Scheveningen. Heimann found this castle
marvelous, very, very luxurious place with 2 large buildings, a big lake, several sports facilities like for hockey playing, for soccer playing, for baseball. And we had teachers coming in and train us in English. And we also had a teacher of Spanish that came once a week. And we also studied everything about the English currency, because many people was thinking of going possibly later to England.
This charming life didn't last very long. As of May 10, 1940, Germany invaded Holland. Those days, the first days, we slept in a cellar, afraid of being bombed. Rotterdam was badly bombed, so badly that we could hear the bombs going off. We were there 5 days under those conditions, and the Germans insisted that all Jews must leave at least 30 kilometers from the sea.
When they came, they informed the directors that they were interested in using this excellent site for their naval high command, and that because it was on a hill and it had all the facilities that they were looking for their high-ranking officers, that they had to somehow move the people out. So immediately they went to work. They called the highest organization in the Dutch community, and they found families for some of the people that were going to different cities in Holland. And we unfortunately did not have the good luck to be sent to a family, which we would have preferred. And they said, you and you, but 30 of us go to the Dutch Jewish orphanage in Amsterdam. So we were moved to Amsterdam, and that was a completely different environment, very, very severe discipline, very strict. The woman director was very, very strict and difficult with us, because she didn't really like the fact that we, German, Jewish people, were invading their orphanage.
Alex stayed on in that orphanage, but I and a friend of mine, a Viennese boy, were taken to a farm in Gouda. This was a farm that was run by a Jewish organization preparing people to go to Israel. It wasn't really much of a farm. It was primarily just tomato hothouses. My job was to repair the glass panes which were constantly breaking in those hothouses. And making things worse, we wore these wooden shoes. And as I was climbing up on those glass houses to repair glass, while I was repairing a glass, I was breaking glass with my shoes. So it was an unending job that I had. I stayed there much of the summer and was taken then to Eindhoven to be put up with a Jewish family. Again, while in Eindhoven, I enrolled in the Amherst School Professional, the vocational school system. Meanwhile, my parents, who had stayed behind in Berlin, had the intention of, if we could get a visa to go to America, they would go via Holland and pick us up. That, of course, was no longer possible. An interesting, an unbelievable circumstance I found only later. My parents, in December 1938, received a deportation order to leave Germany. Sounds terrible, but of course that's what I wanted to do, to leave Germany. That deportation order, I can't imagine, it must have been in the mail the day that I left, because it's dated December something, and I left December. At any rate, much as they wanted to leave, they weren't able to leave because their papers for the US were not ready. And surprisingly, my father got one extension after another. The deportation order said you must leave Germany within 2 weeks or 3 weeks. December 14, 1939, finally my parents boarded a boat in Norway for the US, where they were greeted by my father's brother, Tscherny, who had provided the affidavit. Their name was slightly different than ours, a different spelling, Tscherny, which in Russian means black. My parents wound up in Newark, New Jersey. Meanwhile, Alex and I were in Holland. Alex still at the Jewish orphanage. I, in the meantime, at this Jewish family in Eindhoven.
Our parents tried very hard to bring us over to the United States to become again a part of the entire family, as we were separated for several years. So they sent us an affidavit, and with that affidavit, we were allowed to go to the American embassy in Rotterdam, port city, where we received a visa to enter the United States. The problem, of course, was how to leave Europe.
And I received a message that I should come to Amsterdam, where a small group of German Jewish children that were in the same boat as I was, that had papers to go to America. There was one problem. In order to go to Portugal, Lisbon, to take a boat, you had to go through France, Spain, and into Portugal. Going through France was no problem because it was occupied by the German. But going through Spain, you needed a transit visa. A catch-22 situation arose in that Spain wouldn't give us transit visas unless Portugal provided an entrance visa because they were afraid we would be stuck. And it went on and on and on. An unfortunate thing is that by this time, most of the consulates in Europe were located in Berlin. Germany had occupied, the better part of Western Europe, and so you had to go back to Berlin because that's where the consulate were. In February 41, Alex and I, along with a group of a dozen other children, went back to Berlin to secure transit visas to go through Spain and entrance visa to get into Portugal. I have to say from the outset that that period probably was the scariest period in my life. We were taken to an old age home. I remember walking into that place thinking I wouldn't be able to stand here 2 weeks. The stench of that place was impossible. And it was a gathering place where some people that had come back from a concentration camp and people that were in the same situation we were in were put up in that place. Berlin was closing in on us. In 1941, we didn't have to wear a Jewish star, but you could only buy food between 3 and 4 in the afternoon, which of course meant that the stores were already empty. Existence was really, really quite horrible. Not knowing whether you will be able to get out was scary. And I didn't realize how scary it was because shortly after we did manage to get out, that Jewish old age home that we were staying at was turned into what is called Sammellager in late 41, which is where all the German Jews from Berlin were gathered to go to Auschwitz and Theresienstadt and various concentration camps. Within a day or two, I received a postcard asking me to appear in front of the Gestapo at the Prinz Albrecht Straße. That was a very scary situation. I went to the Jewish congregation. I said, I got this card What do I do? He says, I'll go with you. When I arrived, I remember going up into a small office. This man started screaming at us, where do you get the nerve coming back to Berlin? You've been deported. Well, I was totally unaware that the deportation order that had been given to my parents had applied to me, and they had never mentioned it. They had said again, you have to leave Berlin within 2 weeks. Well, of course, we hadn't gotten our transit visa through Spain and my entrance visa into Portugal. And as I said, it went back and forth. And this went on for 2 months. Meanwhile, we were getting extensions. I don't know how we managed to. The story goes that there used to be a Jewish police chief in Berlin. I think his name was Weiss. And somebody thought that he still had connections, but I did some research on it later and found that Weiss was no longer in Berlin at that point. So how to explain that we were able to get extensions, I don't know.
After 77 years and recent in-depth research, there is finally a definitive answer to the question of who rescued George and Alexander Tscherny and their refugee compatriots in May of 1941. My name is Giselle Heimann Retain, second cousin of George and Alexander Tscherny. Working with Elena Tscherny, Alexander's wife, a research librarian, I and my team have uncovered the details of the boys' survival. Gertrude Fontaine emerges as a key figure who unlocked every possible door to release the Jewish children of Europe from the fate of persecution and extermination. Gertrude was a trained social worker, an early Zionist, a zealous bureaucrat, an administrator, and a tireless worker, as well as an altruistic woman. She was based in Amsterdam and working for the Jewish Refugee Committee. It was to this committee that George referred when he was asked for his destination by authorities, as he, at 14 and Alex, at 12, crossed the border into Holland. By the outbreak of World War II, it was Gertrude who was responsible for setting up the training program in Holland that received George and Alex. The vision of Gertrude's program was to provide skills and trades that could enable these orphan children to emigrate. Gertrude was also one of the architects of the Kindertransport to England and to Holland. Gertrude and the Jewish Refugee Committee were under constant political as well as financial pressures, coordinating with the American Joint Distribution Committee, HIAS, HICEM, and other Jewish relief sources. By the time George and Alex's parents were settled enough in the United States to provide affidavits and passage for their sons at the end of 1940, there was no issuing consulate for visas out of Holland to Lisbon left in Amsterdam. So George and Alex had to take the incredible risk of going back to Nazi Berlin to where the embassies were in order to get their visas in February of 1941. George specifically describes the circumstances in a document which he wrote to Ms. Kissing, a Dutch journalist, in 2011, who was researching what happened to the foreign children who were in orphanages in Holland. George writes, that February we returned to Berlin, part of a group of 12, all seeking the necessary papers to travel to Lisbon, Portugal. In Berlin, they were stranded for months with a cohort of other children, known as the 12 Berlin Group, waiting for the Portuguese government to allow them entrance to Portugal so they could reach their ship in Lisbon. In late April, early May of 1941, Gertrude bravely made the trip from Amsterdam to Lisbon, trying to ease the bottleneck of emigration out of the last open port in Europe. Fortunately for our story, her next stop was Berlin, where she was to meet with the agency that oversaw the case of George and Alex and the Berlin Group 12. What we have found is that in her letter of the 14th of May, 1941, to M.C. Troper of the American Joint Distribution Committee, a leader himself, she makes the specific request that he add the 12 Berlin group to his list of passengers with the best likelihood of transit visas to pass from Germany to Lisbon. And now I read from the letter. This is from The Wire. Fontaine informs, after thorough discussion, whole situation cannot book more than 26 names already reserved, plus 12 children, Berlin group. Even after her own son was safe in Palestine and her daughter had sailed for the United States, Gertrude could have saved herself. But no, she continued with her mission to save as many children as she could.
When we finally got on a train to go to Lisbon, Portugal, I was thinking that, I could have been getting on a train instead of going west, going east. Luckily, we managed to get out in the beginning of June, the end of May. We were on a sealed train. We laughed about that because, we thought, are they afraid that we're going to get off the train? I mean, in retrospect, I realized that this train was sealed because they weren't afraid we would get off. They were afraid that people would get on. Anyway, the train stopped in Paris at the railroad station. We didn't get off. We were met by some people, again, some Jewish committee, that handed us a baguette and a salami. And so we had something to eat on the train and continued on. And the first time we got off the train was in San Sebastian in Spain. Now, Spain had just barely recovered from the Spanish Civil War. And I remember being put up in this very elegant, superb hotel in San Sebastian. But when it came to eating, we were given a plate with one little sardine on it or something like that. But at any rate, we were free. And that was really the main thing. We continued on to Lisbon, Portugal. I wrote a postcard, and I also have a copy of the postcard that I wrote to my parents when we arrived in Holland. These two postcards you must see side by side because they're like two bookends to a story. The postcard that I sent when we arrived in Holland was still written in German script, Zitterlinschrift. And the postcard that I wrote from Lisbon was in regular Arab script. And it tells a story, that this transition from one life to another. Arriving in Lisbon and walking the streets was really like going from night to day. I mean, Europe, was still under war conditions. All windows were sealed black so they wouldn't have lights on the streets. In Portugal, the streets were lit, like Times Square is now. There was food in the stores. So it was really quite a shock. We stayed there about 10 days. One sort of amusing story is that while we had eaten the baguette that were given to us in Paris, we had about 3/4 of the salami still. One of the things that we were always aware of, is not to get noticed. And here we were with this salami smelling, and we had a little suitcase which we didn't need anymore because we didn't have anything else in it. I took the salami in that little suitcase. We went on a street, so there was sort of a triangular house. I left the suitcase on the sidewalk and quickly walked around the triangular house, and for all I know, that salami is still there. We were ready to book on a ship called the Mouzinho for June 10, 1941, and the only thing really still worrisome at that point was that German U-boats were sinking ships left and right. So that was a concern in the back of our mind, whether we were going to get to New York. The strangest thing about it is that my memory is only I spent the 10 days that it took to get to New York, 11 days on deck, never below deck, and it was the middle of summer. When I arrived in New York, supposedly there were hundreds of other children on that ship. I never saw any. There may have been several levels on that boat, I don't know. But we still have a list of people that were on that ship, and they were listed June 21, and there's a newspaper announcement that the ship is arriving in, of all places, Staten Island. We arrived the night of June 20 to 21, 1941, and the boat was sitting in a harbor. Apparently it couldn't land until the morning, I guess. In the morning we went downstairs, and there were my parents, my cousins, Morris Tscherny and Teuve Tscherny, who met us, was taken back to Newark to my parents, who had an apartment on Clinton Avenue in Newark, New Jersey. America was not yet in the war, but the war effort to supply England with weapons and machinery was really taking hold in the US. And there was a program that I think the National Youth Administration offered. They would make you a machine operator in 6 weeks. And I signed up for that. And 6 weeks later, I was a machine operator making 70 cents an hour. I was going to Berger Evening High School from about, let's say, 7 to 11 in the evening. And after my high school, went to my job at the Newfound factory job, operating a turret lathe. Meanwhile, America entered the war. In 1943, I went into the army. I was shipped off to Rockford, Illinois, to take my basic training. When I finished basic training, came back to a camp in Pennsylvania, which was sort of a transition camp where people were being selected to go to the Pacific, to go to Europe. Since they knew my German background, they obviously, the sensible thing was for me to go to Europe and not the Pacific. In May 43, I found myself on a Liberty ship, really the smallest ocean-going vessel that the Army had, going to England. We arrived in, I think, Cardiff, England, and were shipped to a holding place in Winchester. At that point, the US had entered war, and we were just really waiting for the Normandy invasion. We kept moving closer and closer to the southern part of England, near Southampton, so that where the ships were leaving. July 24, I landed on Utah Beach there was still no port. We had to climb down the ship and get into landing craft. And I was attached to a small prisoner of war stockade as an interpreter. That stockade was put up to help to establish the first medical facility the US had in France. These were tents where they were able to do surgery and what have you. What the German prisoners did to some degree is pour cement floors so that the medical equipment could rest on that, Xerox machines and what have you. The prisoners had it very good. They had the same food that we did. The spring of 45, I joined military government, first in Karlsruhe and then in Mannheim. And I functioned as an interpreter, and I stayed there till January 46, when I was discharged from the army. And in Mannheim, I managed remnants of a small Jewish community. I remember heading for our office there, and a young man was coming at me in a dark blue suit, and I noticed he had a Bogen Dovet on his lapel. I asked him about that, and yes, his name was Ernst Michel. He had survived Auschwitz. And the interesting thing about this also is that he came eventually to the US and became the head of the UGA in the US. I was discharged from the army. The big question is, now what? I knew I wasn't going to go back to the factory job in Newark, New Jersey. I had the GI Bill, which gave me some time to think about things, what I want to do and how to proceed. It was sort of a period of finding yourself. I did know that I was interested in art, and I thought, for the first time in my life, I can afford to go to art school. In Newark, there was a school called School of Fine Industrial Arts. As I found out, it wasn't particularly distinguished, but it was a start. And it was a start in that I got my feet wet in the art. Meanwhile, it had been pointed out to me that I must really go to a better school, and I should go to Pratt Institute. I became more sophisticated about the arts in general. On April 27, in 1947, there was a performance, and for $1.20 in the back row of a Ziegfeld Theater, you could really see wonderful dance. Alex came with me, actually, and next to me was a vivacious young girl. At the end of the performance, we walked out. I saw Sonia coming down the stairs, and our eyes sort of connected, and I asked her for a date. And we are here 70 years later. A word about Sonia's family and Sonia. Sonia was born February 4th, 1930 in Prague. Her father, Francis Katz, was a lawyer for a large corporation in Prague and was married to Ida Jungmann-Katz. Sonia had a little brother, 6 years younger. They both lived very comfortably in Prague until things began heating up because of possible German invasion of Czechoslovakia. In March of 1939, when just about the Germans were marching into Czechoslovakia, her father decided to pack up things and emigrate. They took a train to Holland, where they took a boat to London, and then moved on to Canada, where the family lived for several years. In 1940, they managed to get their papers in order to come to the US, and they settled in Forest Hills, Queens, where Sonia grew up, had her schooling through high school, and then on to Queens College. We had our first child, Nadia, in 1953, which was shortly followed 2 years later by Carla. We were a very, very happy family in Forest Hills. I, meanwhile, had started my first job in 1950 with Donald Desky and Associates, who was a well-known industrial designer, best known for his interior design of the Radio City Music Hall. I then, in 1953, moved on to the office of George Nelson and Company. The Nelson office was really a focal point of design in New York in those years. In 1955, I left Nelson and opened an independent design studio on East 46th Street. And as I became better known as a designer, moved to a larger office on 57th Street, and then to an even larger office on 53rd Street, until we wound up in our house on 72nd Street. In 1955, when I had opened my independent design studio, I also began teaching at the School of Visual Arts. And that has been a relationship to this very day. My work became more and more important. It was recognized, which was gratifying, appeared in journals, in collections of museums, without singling out any particular projects that I had been involved in. I thought it might be best to show projects that involved my family, which was used very frequently as models. Sonia more often than anybody, but daughter Nadia, Carla, even my grandson Max found their way in certain projects that we produced. My parents, who lived in Newark, New Jersey when they first came to the States, finally were able to live a fairly comfortable life in their own little house in Newark, until we really wanted them to be closer, and they came and lived in an apartment in Forest Hills and enjoyed our little children. My brother married Elena and came to live in Washington. I've had a very happy life, a long life. The family life has been wonderful. I've been successful in my profession. I really couldn't have asked for anything more.
Student Tells of Berlin by Alexander Tscherny, published in the Mexico City Collegian newspaper on August 6, 1953. The current headlines of horror and terror in East Berlin, Germany, certainly are reminiscent of the same sort of situation 15 years ago. It was 1938, in my birthplace Berlin, when terror and bloodshed forced my brother and I to flee to Holland for shelter. We crossed the border illegally, but were allowed to stay in that hospitable country. Moving from refugee camp to refugee camp, we finally moved into an abandoned castle that had belonged to an Austrian baron who had moved to Argentina. There we had all the freedom possible and were also able to go to school. But this situation just could not last. Suddenly, the drone of planes covering the blue skies on that memorable day of May 10th, 1940, shattered our dream world into pieces. A platoon of Dutch soldiers occupied our estate and took us into protective custody. Being located in the woods of the famous resort Scheveningen, located on the North Sea, we were somewhat more sheltered than living in the nearby capital of The Hague. During that first week of fighting, a family of Austrian refugees took shelter in our large house as theirs had been bombed. On the 10th day of fighting, when the Dutch surrendered, we found husband and wife had committed suicide. They were political exiles and did not want to live under the Germans again. After the surrender, the German Navy High Command forced us to leave the castle within 48 hours, as it was needed for their headquarters. Thus, all of the 170 children who had lived there were scattered all over the country. I went to an orphanage in Amsterdam, somewhat similar to the one in the tales of Charles Dickens. The boys had shaved heads, wore uniforms, and the disciplining was very rigid. I was not used to such treatment, but had to grin and bear it. The first year under German occupation was not easy, but everybody seemed to take it in his stride. Every night, the British bombers bombed the city, and in the morning one would see the damages left behind. Inaccurate bombing certainly left a tremendous toll on civilians. My parents, in the meantime, having arrived in the U.S. in 1939, were finally able to send us the affidavits necessary, and we proceeded to go back to Berlin on February 1st, 1941, in order to receive our Spanish transit visas and to go from there to Lisbon, Portugal, the only remaining open port in Europe at that time. Again, misfortune seemed to be with us. The Spanish consul in Berlin refused to give us the visa, and while waiting to get it from the Spanish consul in Amsterdam, our American visas and passports were cancelled. At that moment, we were in danger of ending up in a concentration camp, as we had been forced out of Germany previously and were not to return ever again. Through connections of the former chief of police in Berlin, we were granted another 2-month stay in order to get our difficulties straightened out. Through a great amount of effort by the refugee organizations, we were able to get everything in order and proceeded to Lisbon by way of France and Spain. We waited in Lisbon 10 days to get on a converted banana freighter that carried an overload of 400 persons. We gave our cabins to some older people who were sleeping in the baggage room, and we slept all the way on the top deck. Dodging minefields for 10 days in the Atlantic Ocean, we finally saw the Statue of Liberty in the harbor of New York on June 21st, 1941, the day the Germans invaded Russia.
We would like to thank and acknowledge Bernard Wasserstein, the Harriet and Ulrich Meijer Professor Emeritus of Modern European Jewish History at the University of Chicago, for his meticulous research and his careful archives on this subject. The publication of his important book, The Ambiguity of Virtue, Gertrude Fontaine and the Fate of the Dutch Jews, published in 2014 by Harvard University Press, as well as the supporting documents for the book found at the University of Chicago's Regenstein Library Special Collections Research Center, provide confirmation that George and Alex Tscherny and the 12 Berlin group were indeed rescued from annihilation by Gertrude Fontaine. We are very grateful to the archivists at the University of Chicago's Regenstein Library Special Collections, who retrieved and organized the important boxes of research into original papers and correspondence. We would also like to thank and acknowledge Kurt Roberg, one of the 12 Berlin group, who has provided a wealth of knowledge on the improbable escape from Nazi Germany, based on his captivating memoir, A Visa or Your Life. Kurt has donated his extensive collection of family Holocaust documents and memorabilia to the Jewish Museum Berlin, where they were a substantial part of the museum's largest temporary exhibit, Heimat und Exil, Home and Exile, 2006 through 2008. For the past 15 years, he has also been an annual participant in the museum's renowned Holocaust Eyewitness Workshop program, working with German high school students and student teachers, adding to their history knowledge with his personal Holocaust experiences.